Welcome to The Truth is Out There. Today we're talking about journalism and activism. The question is, do these two things go hand in hand, or are they entirely separate? Do journalists need to stay impartial no matter the story, or as we see our political and social climate alter quickly, are journalists expected to remove themselves from these situations? Journalism and activism. The truth is out there, and we'll help you find it. So today we're going to be working through our Truth is Out There guide, which can be found on our library's website, maryville.edu/library. We're going to go under Resources to Subject Guides, and then we'll scroll all the way to the bottom to get to the Truth is Out There. Here you can find all our past Truth is Out There's and also this week's Journalism and Activism. Once we're here, we can navigate the guide using the tabs to the left. Before we dive in, I think it's important to know what we're researching, so I've included a page of definitions about the terms we'll be discussing today. There are many kinds of journalism, and it's important to know this since each type is out to accomplish a different goal. As our society evolves, so does our media and our journalism. First, we have definitions for activists and advocacy. Activism is the process by which individuals or groups use actions to bring about social or political change. Advocacy is the act of influencing decision-making and planning. I think in people's minds, well, at least mine, when we think of activists, we think of people marching in the streets and holding up signs with clever slogans, and we don't necessarily just think of someone sitting behind a desk. I think these two definitions are interesting because it's clear that activists are taking action, and advocacy is when you influence stakeholders or decision makers for particular groups or agendas. Advocacy doesn't necessarily need to be tied to social justice, and neither does activism, but that's where we see it most prevalently in our society. This brings us to our journalism definitions. So journalism is the act of producing media, print, broadcast, or otherwise, for consumption by the general public that covers newsworthy events. So I give examples of each type of journalism underneath. So a prime example of classic journalism can just be found on the front page of the New York Times. Citizen journalism refers to the reporting of news events by people without journalism training. These non-professionals use the internet and social media to spread information. Citizen journalism has exploded in the age of the smartphone, and this is the idea that people with no journalism experience are starting to be news reporters. Just think of all of those live streamers on Instagram or Facebook, streaming from some political rally, protest, or speech, or maybe just somewhere you've never been before. They're not necessarily giving us news, but they are allowing us to experience situations firsthand with no overlaying opinions, investigations, or journalistic follow-ups. So one example of citizen journalism is from 2014 in the Ferguson protests. We saw a spike in people live streaming and tweeting and taking photos that were very different than what the newspapers were often reporting. Gonzo journalism, the definition, is journalism that treats a subject in a very personal, unusual, and often shocking way. Gonzo journalism is a unique form in which the reporter is part of the story. They immerse themselves in their work, and they are not only reporting, but experiencing. So this can make it very difficult to remain impartial or opinionless, as they are often a character in their story. Investigative journalism is a type of journalism that tries to discover information of public interest that someone is trying to hide. While I couldn't find a clear definition for public service journalism, we can look at the definition for public service, which is a service rendered in the public interest. So public service journalism is reporting that benefits the public in which the reporter serves. It's also important to know what values and ethics our media holds valuable. While there is an industry standard from the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, it isn't legally required for journalists to follow this. Also, each media outlet is allowed to tweak and add in whatever they see fit. So each paper might have a different set of standards and ethics. Here are a few listed below, but try and find the standard and ethics page for your favorite reporting platform. So now that we have set the groundwork, let's go ahead and dive in. Our main debate today is journalism versus activism. I'm so sorry, but today's truth is just a long string of very hard questions with no clear yes or no answers. But hopefully some of the following resources spark interest in the debate and can give you enough information to formulate your own opinions. So let's go ahead and dive in. Journalism versus activism. So to be able to fully understand where journalism and activism connect and disconnect, it's important to get a well-rounded view on the issue by looking at additional sources. And these can be statements from journalists, videos, articles, or even tweets. So let's go ahead and look at the section and see what we can find. So what is the distinction between the two? This image leads us to a video from a CNN story from the show Reliable Sources. During this episode, the host interviews a student journalist from Parkland High School. As we may or may not know, the Parkland students have been pushing more gun control laws since the tragic shooting at their school. So this person is very closely tied to this issue at hand. Let's go ahead and click on this here. So now that we're here on the CNN page, where we have the clip of the video from Reliable Sources, we can see that the title is Journalism and Activism. This Reliable Sources segment has sparked a debate. So this video clip has sparked quite the argument online, and we can see why here in a second.
Is Rebecca Schneid. She's a co-editor-in-chief of the school's paper, The Eagle Eye. She posted this article today on The Guardian. And also here with me is Lois Beckett, a senior reporter for The Guardian US. Rebecca, I wonder what yesterday felt like for you, because I see a lot of Parkland students becoming activists, but you over there as journalists. Do you see a difference right now between journalism and activism and what you're doing?
I think that for me, the purpose of journalism is to raise, the voices of people that maybe don't have a voice. And so I think that in its own right, journalism is a form of activism. And I think that there is distinctions for me, as a journalist and also as someone that wants to demand change. But I think that the partnership of the two is the only reason that we are able to make a change.
So the Parkland student has said that she believes that activism and journalism go hand in hand. And if they're not the same thing, then they feed and benefit off of one another, because activists want change and journalists can make change happen. So now that we're back on our guide, let's go ahead and look at the rest of the information here. But let's go ahead and scroll down. We have a couple articles here that talk about this very issue. So the first one is, where does journalism end and activism begin? This talks about polarizing political movements and how they can be very divisive in journalism rooms, newsrooms, and even in the actual reporting itself. The next article is from Opposing Viewpoints in Context, which is one of our databases here at the library, and it's about questioning journalistic objectivity. Are good journalists actually objective? Is it important that journalists are objective? Is it responsible for journalists to report on specific things in an objective way? And then the third one is a year to embrace journalism as public service. So we talked about public service journalism as one of our definitions. And so it's interesting to think about, how does public service differ from activism? If we scroll down, we do have a Twitter feed here that is in direct response to the Reliable Sources video above. So the first quote, the one in the middle there from Hotline Josh, journalism isn't activism. It's presenting the facts honestly and objectively. It's the mentality that's killing trust in our profession. And then there was a response to that by Matt D. Pierce. Journalism is activism in its most basic form. The entire basis for this ethical practice is the idea that democracy requires an informed citizenry in order to function. Choosing what you want people to know is a form of activism, even if it's not the march and protest kind. So back at the beginning of the video, I said, when I think of activism, I do think of people marching in the streets, carrying signs, but Matt Pierce is saying that not all activism looks the same. So maybe somebody sitting behind a desk choosing what to write is very much a form of activism. So the fact that journalism and journalists are writing for change makes them activists in the mind of Matt Pierce. So where do you stand on this? Would you agree more with Josh, or would you agree more with Matt? Let's go ahead and go to our video section. So even the most famous and well-known journalists can't really agree on this issue. So we have a couple TED Talks here. The first one is from Ann Curry. The quote above is a direct quote from the TED Talk below, How to Restore Trust in Journalism. We have witnessed the stunning growth of openly biased news coverage, especially on cable television, where not everyone who is telling us the news is actually a journalist. Some are advocates with political agendas, some are activists, some are former political operatives, and some are what we once called opinionators, people whose profession it is to give their opinions and theories. Ann Curry has a very clear separation between journalists and activists. She's saying that activists aren't actually journalists, but what if a journalist decides to become an activist in a particular issue and then they have to report on that issue? We're going to go ahead and scroll down to our next TED Talk from Jorge Ramos. He's a famous Mexican-American journalist, and he was recently in the news because of his conflicts with the President of the United States. So the first quote from his TED Talk is, "I refuse to take out my cell phone and hit the record button and point it in front of me. That is not true journalism. Contrary to what people think, journalists are making value judgments all the time, ethical and moral judgments, and we're always making decisions that are increasingly personal and extraordinarily subjective." His second quote is, "The second lesson was that I needed to stop being neutral. At that point, from then on, my mission as a journalist changed." So his TED Talk is very much about how his personal experiences and his life have very much influenced the way he reports on news. The first quote is in direct correlation to that idea of citizen journalism, where they are not just presenting what's happening, they are making choices about which information to present and which situations to write about. And so just taking out your cell phone and recording something in front of you is not necessarily journalism, because it doesn't have that overlying layer of journalistic expertise. And so he's saying that inherently journalism is subjective. His second quote ties directly to his experiences of being forcefully removed from a press conference, and that it was no longer productive to be neutral, especially in terms of immigration, which is what he's referring to in this direct quote. All of that ties directly into this last TED Talk, which is about a reporter who started broadcasting with his cell phone. So he was doing the live streaming, even though he is a professionally trained journalist. But this TED Talk, he's really advising everyone to do that. If you have a smartphone, start broadcasting. And that way we can get as many perspectives from different scenarios as possible. But if we tie it directly to what Jorge's written, he's saying that that's definitely not journalism. The next part of our guide is statistics. So let's go ahead and look at some stats from one of our databases here at the library. It's called Statista, and it's a wonderful place to find statistics on almost any topic. So below we have information about how journalists see their position based off of the public. So public and journalists' view on the media's duties diverge. So we can see that there's a lot of differences here in this graph on what people think news should do. Our second statistic is showing the number of journalists that have been imprisoned around the world since 2000. So is reporting on news stories that can get you arrested a form of activism? So there are obviously people who don't want reporters doing what they do, and yet they do it anyway. Is this a form of activism? Our next tab is additional resources. So our additional resources are really just to help learn more on this topic, but also find reliable places to go for news. Today we talked about journalism and activism. We looked at multiple perspectives from multiple people, and there seemed to be a bit of a conflict within the profession itself when it comes to the question, are journalists activists? While we didn't find any defining answers today, we were able to gather resources to help you, the researcher, come to your own conclusions. So, do you believe journalism is a form of activism? Journalism. The truth is out there, we just have to find it.